I never thought I'd end up here, abandoned, alone, and completely stripped of the life I worked so hard to build. At 72, I find myself in a nursing home, staring at the cracked ceiling, wondering where everything went wrong. There are so many things I never expected at this stage in my life. Betrayal? Yes, but not from the people I trusted the most. My own flesh and blood, the very ones I sacrificed for, are the ones who left me here to rot. As the days slip by, my thoughts swirl around the endless hours spent in silence. I often hear the staff whispering, but I'm too old to matter. My health has deteriorated, and with it, my ability to stand up for myself. The very hands that once cradled my children now tremble as I try to hold on to the last shreds of dignity. But what hurts the most? It's not the silence of the nursing home or even the daily physical decline. It's the realization that I was used, financially exploited, emotionally manipulated, and finally discarded like I meant nothing. When I think of the years I spent supporting my children, the sacrifices, the unspoken hours of labor and love, I am sickened by the injustice of it all. What hurts even more is knowing they did it all for one thing: money. I can't help but wonder how they could do this to me after all the years I spent giving them everything I had. And as I sit here, I know one thing for sure: justice is coming. You see, this story doesn't end with me alone in a nursing home. Oh no, it will end with them paying for everything they've done. I'll make sure of it. They may have thought they won, but the truth is, the story is far from over. I'll be the one to make them regret every decision they ever made. Let me take you back to a time when everything was different, when I was a proud mother, full of hope and love for my children. Back then, they were the world to me. I gave them everything, even when it meant sacrificing my own dreams. I watched them grow up, send them off to school, and then, when I could, I helped them with their families. I made sure they never lacked for anything, no matter how hard it was for me. But something changed. It wasn't immediate. It was gradual, like the slow creeping shadow of a storm. At first, it was small things. They'd ask for a little extra help with bills or say they needed help with a car payment. I didn't mind. I loved them. I thought it was my duty, my privilege to help them however I could. But over time, the requests became more frequent, more urgent, and when I couldn't give as much, they began to distance themselves. I thought it was just a phase, something they'd grow out of. I couldn't have been more wrong. Then came the moment that changed everything. My husband passed away after a long, painful battle with cancer. I was left with nothing but memories and a small pension. I didn't ask my children for anything. I'd been able to manage on my own. But that was before the real burden began. The debts, the bills, and the endless pressure to give more than I had. My children knew I had money saved up. I never told them exactly how much, but they must have known. It wasn't long before they started calling more often, asking for help with mortgages, college fees, and, in one case, a failed business venture.
Each time I gave, I didn't question it. How could I? They were my children, my blood. They needed me. I thought I was doing the right thing, but it wasn't just the money. No, that would have been easier to understand. It was the way they treated me after, the way they made me feel invisible, irrelevant, as if my years of sacrifice meant nothing. They started sending me to a nursing home, telling me it was for my health. The lies they fed me, the promises they made, all of it fell apart when I realized that they just didn't care anymore. I'm sure you felt this betrayal before. Maybe it wasn't a nursing home for you, but the isolation, the exclusion during holidays, the feeling of being discarded. If you've ever been treated like this by those you love, then you know exactly what it feels like to be betrayed by family. I'm asking you now, share your stories with me. Tell me how you were treated, how your family used you. Let's talk about it because you're not alone. And trust me when I say that this betrayal won't go unanswered. What I've endured, what they've put me through, will have consequences. You don't just take someone's life, their trust, and their love and get away with it. That's not how the world works. It's not how my story ends, not by a long shot. You'll hear the rest of this story about how it all unraveled, about the revenge that was almost too sweet to taste. But before we dive into that, let me tell you a little more about my past, about the love I gave freely and the pain I never expected to feel in my later years. When I close my eyes, I can still see him, my late husband, David, standing in our small kitchen, making tea in his favorite mug. His laugh would fill the room, echoing in our hearts like a melody we never wanted to end. We were partners in every sense of the word, and I thought we would grow old together. He was the love of my life, the one person who understood the sacrifices I made and the dreams I had. I thought we'd spend our golden years sitting on the porch, watching the sun set over our home, a home we worked so hard to build. But those dreams faded away in an instant, when cancer took him away from me, leaving me with only memories and a deep, aching hole in my heart. David and I had always believed in taking care of one another. We shared everything, our dreams, our burdens, and most importantly, our love. We didn't need much more. I remember the days when we talk about what we do when we retired. We travel, visit places we had only seen in books, and give back to the community. But life had other plans. When David fell ill, all those dreams, those quiet evenings we had promised each other, vanished into the distance.
"Mortgage, can you help?" they would say. "We need a little more money for the kids' tuition. Could you send over a check?" And I did. Every time. I sent the money because I loved them, and I always believed that helping them was the right thing to do. How could I say no? They were my children, my flesh and blood, the ones I raised with all the love and care I had. David would have done the same, I thought. Together, we sacrificed for them, gave up our own comfort so they could have what they needed. It felt like the natural thing to do. The first time I really saw the cost of my sacrifices was when I handed over $5,000 to my daughter, Sarah, to pay off a car loan. It was a significant amount for someone on a fixed income, but it wasn't just about the money. It was the way Sarah said, "Thank you, Mom," and the way it sounded hollow in my ears. That should have been a red flag, but I ignored it. She was going through a tough time, I reasoned. What kind of mother would I be if I didn't help her? And then there was Robert, my oldest son, who'd been out of work for months. I helped him with his rent, again and again. Another $4,000 here, $2,500 there. I didn't even think twice. If they needed me, I was going to be there, no matter what. Even when it started to affect my own well-being, when I began skipping doctor's appointments and cutting back on essentials. My children needed me, and I needed them to be okay. Looking back, it feels like I was on autopilot, mindlessly handing over the money, thinking that one day things would get better. But they never did. The requests kept coming, each more urgent than the last. By the time David passed away, I had already given away over $30,000, money I could never get back. It was never about the money. It was about keeping the family together, holding on to the dream that we'd all be okay. But somewhere along the way, that dream slipped through my fingers. There were moments when I started to feel the weight of the burden. I'd see my friends at church or the grocery store. their children living comfortably and visiting them regularly. I'd think about how little I saw of my own children. A birthday call here, a brief visit there, and always with some sort of request attached. And yet, I kept making excuses for them. They're busy, I'd tell myself. They're struggling. I convinced myself that this was what being a mother was, sacrifice without question. I just never imagined that my sacrifices would be taken for granted. The first real warning sign, however, came when Sarah asked me for money to cover a down payment on a new house. "Mom, we found a perfect place for the family. It's a bit out of our budget, but if you could help us with $15,000, we could make it work." I was already stretched thin, barely able to pay my own bills. But I agreed. I didn't even hesitate. "Of course, sweetheart," I said, writing out the check. It was a decision I would come to regret. The new house, I later learned, was for her and her husband. They didn't even want me to live with them anymore. That's when I started to feel the first pangs of betrayal, but I brushed it aside, telling myself that I was just being paranoid. After all, they were my children. They loved me. Surely they wouldn't let me down. How wrong I was. The emotional distance between us began to grow, and soon I became just a source of money to them. The visits slowed down, the calls stopped coming. I was being left behind. I kept telling myself that things would get better, that they were just going through a phase, and yet the signs kept piling up. The one thing that David and I had always believed in, loyalty, family, respect, those were the cornerstones of our life, the things that David and I believed in with all our hearts. But now it felt like those values had been forgotten. I had raised them to care for one another, to always have each other's backs. Instead, they had turned their backs on me when I needed them most. And now, as I sit in this cold, sterile nursing home, I wonder how things went so wrong. What did I do to deserve this, to be cast aside in my twilight years? Alone and forgotten? I had given them my love, my money, my time, and yet they treated me like an afterthought. How could they betray me like this? It wasn't a single moment, but a series of small ones that led to my breaking point. The tipping point, however, came on one cold, lonely afternoon when I realized that my children had abandoned me completely. It was the day they sent me to the nursing home. I remember it clearly, the sterile smell of antiseptic in the air, the cold, unfamiliar bed, and the soft hum of fluorescent lights above me. I never imagined that this would be my fate. I had always thought I'd be surrounded by family in my later years. Instead, I lay in a bed in a place where no one truly cared for me, a place I had no intention of ever visiting until I had no other choice. It started with a simple phone call from Sarah. "Mom, we think it's time," she said. "You need more care than we can provide. We've found a great place for you." Her voice was cold, distant. There was no warmth, no hint of compassion, just business. I could hear her shuffling papers in the background as if I were a mere item to be dealt with. But what hurt more than anything was the decision that led to that phone call. It wasn't because they were worried about my health. No, it's because they didn't want to care for me anymore. They had tired of me. I had become a burden, a reminder of their financial guilt, perhaps. I wasn't their mother anymore. I was just another expense. When I arrived at the nursing home, my heart sunk. The walls were white and sterile, the floors cold and uninviting. The other residents were either asleep or lost in their own world, leaving me to wonder if anyone even noticed when I walked in. I couldn't help but feel abandoned. I had given them everything, and this was how they repaid me? This was my reward for all those years of sacrifice? I waited for a week, before I finally picked up the phone and called Sarah. I could feel my chest tighten as I dialed her number. When she answered, there was no hesitation in my voice. I was done being weak. "Sarah," I began, my voice trembling with anger. "How could you do this to me? You left me in that place like I was some unwanted item. You promised you would care for me, that we would be together in my old age. What happened to that promise?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line, as if she was caught off guard. Then she sighed. "Mom, you know we can't do this. It's too much for us. We all have our own lives now. You're just going to have to get used to it." I could hear the dismissiveness in her voice, the way she spoke to me as if I were an inconvenience. And in that moment, something inside me snapped. "Used to it?" I asked, my voice rising, barely able to control the fury swelling inside me. "I gave you everything. I sacrificed my life for you. And this is how you repay me? You let me rot in here, abandoned and alone while you go on with your life?" She didn't answer right away. I could hear her shifting in her chair, the guilt perhaps starting to settle in, but she quickly masked it. "Mom, we've been over this. It's for your own good. You don't understand." My heart pounded in my chest as I realized the truth. I had been used. For years, they had drained me dry, taking my money, my time, and my love. And now that I was no longer useful to them, I was discarded without a second thought. I had always believed in family, in loyalty, and respect, values that I thought I had passed on to my children. But in that moment, I understood that I had been naive. They had used me for their own gain, and when they no longer needed me, they threw me away. The anger I felt was indescribable. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the crushing weight of the years I had spent giving everything I had to them, without question, without hesitation, only to be cast aside when I was no longer useful. I had spent my whole life believing in family, in loyalty, and respect, values I thought I had passed on to my children. But in that moment, I understood that I had been naive. They had used me for their own gain, and when they no longer needed me, they threw me away. The anger I felt was indescribable. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the crushing weight of the years I had spent giving everything I had to them, without question, without hesitation, only to be cast aside when I was no longer useful. I had spent my whole life believing in family, in loyalty, and respect, values I thought I had passed on to my children. But in that moment,
This was an emotionally charged, deeply personal story of an elderly woman's betrayal by her family. My love, my dignity, my trust, and now I was going to take back what was mine. I wasn't going to let them get away with this betrayal. From that moment on, I made a vow to myself. I would not allow them to exploit me any longer. I would fight back, and I would do whatever it took to make them face the consequences of their actions. They thought they could walk away from me without a second thought, but they were wrong. I began to formulate a plan that would not only expose their greed, but also show them that I wasn't the helpless, vulnerable woman they thought I had become. I was going to make them understand what it meant to betray their mother. The days after my confrontation with Sarah passed in a haze of frustration, but one thing was clear. I couldn't go on letting them get away with it. The betrayal stung more than I ever imagined possible, and with every passing hour, my anger only grew stronger.
But this time, it wasn't about yelling or crying out for justice. It was about methodical, cold determination. I wasn't going to fight this battle with emotion alone. I was going to fight it with evidence, with facts, with everything I had. The first step in my plan was to gather every shred of financial documentation that I had. I didn't trust anyone anymore, least of all my children. I needed to see for myself the extent of the damage they had caused. So I went through every old bank statement, every credit card bill, every receipt I could find. The ones I had saved over the years, thinking they might come in handy one day. I spread them all out on my small table in the nursing home. The paper rustled as I flipped through them, my heart racing with each number I saw. Thousands of dollars. Money I had sent for emergencies, for bills, for investments. As I pieced everything together, a sickening realization hit me. They had drained me dry. It wasn't just small amounts here and there, it was systematic. The payments started small, a few $100s here, 1,000 there. But the numbers quickly escalated. Over the past 5 years, I had given them more than $40,000, money I could never afford to lose. I had used every penny I had to support them, and in return, they had abandoned me when I needed them most. I wasn't just being financially exploited, I was being emotionally manipulated too. Each request, each emergency had been a carefully crafted tactic to get what they wanted, and I had fallen for it every single time. But I wasn't the only one they had exploited. My son, Robert, had gotten himself into a financial mess with his business, and I had always stepped in to help him. What they didn't know, what they never considered, was that I had kept track of every single transaction. Over the years, I had loaned him nearly $25,000, money that he promised he would pay back, but never did. Each loan had been justified with excuses, lies, and broken promises, and I kept believing them, kept handing over the money because I wanted to believe in the family I had raised. But the truth was, they had no intention of paying me back. They never cared about my financial stability. They only cared about using me for their own benefit. The realization was like a slap in the face. I had been living in a fog, blinded by my love for them, my desire to keep the family intact. But now the fog had lifted, and I saw them for what they truly were: opportunistic, selfish, and callous. They had used me for years, and when I was no longer useful to them, they cast me aside without a second thought. I knew I had to take action, but I couldn't do it alone. The next phase of my plan was to consult with a lawyer, someone who could help me navigate the legal side of things. I wasn't just dealing with a family dispute anymore. I was dealing with financial exploitation and, quite frankly, fraud. I needed to be strategic. I needed someone who could help me figure out my rights and the best way to fight back. I began making phone calls to lawyers, explaining my situation in as much detail as I could. It wasn't easy. I could hear the hesitation in their voices, the disbelief at what I was telling them. Family members stealing from an elderly parent? It wasn't something they dealt with every day, I realized. But I refused to give up. After a few days, I found a lawyer who was willing to take on my case. She was sharp, experienced, and seemed genuinely concerned about my situation. Together, we went over the details, building a strategy that would allow me to reclaim my losses. The next few weeks were filled with meetings, phone calls, and long nights of research. I spent hours learning about my rights as an elder, reading everything I could find on financial exploitation and fraud. I knew that if I was going to fight back, I needed to be armed with knowledge. I needed to understand the law, understand the tactics my children had used against me, and find the best way to make them pay for what they had done. During those long nights, something shifted in me. The fear and uncertainty that had plagued me before began to fade, replaced by a quiet, determined confidence. I wasn't just an old woman who had been discarded by her family. I was a mother, a woman who had loved and sacrificed for her children, and I was going to make them see the consequences of their actions. As I sat at my table, reviewing the documents one last time, I calculated the total amount I had lost, both emotionally and financially. The number was staggering. Over the past 5 years, I had given my children more than $70,000, and that didn't even take into account the emotional toll it had taken on me. The countless hours of worry, the sleepless nights, the growing isolation. I had lost so much more than money. I had lost my dignity, my trust, and in many ways, my sense of self. But I was done being the victim. I wasn't going to sit quietly and let them destroy me. I had sacrificed so much for them, and now it was time for me to fight back, for my dignity, for my money, and for my peace of mind. I put down the papers and took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decisions settle in my chest. I was ready. I had everything I needed to make them pay, to expose their betrayal and hold them accountable. The time had come for my first decisive action, and when it came, it would be the beginning of their reckoning. It was time. No more excuses. No more appeasing them. I had spent my entire life giving to my family, sacrificing my own peace and stability for their benefit. But now, the tables were turning. It was my turn to reclaim control. The first step was simple, yet profoundly satisfying. I stopped sending money. I canceled every automatic payment, every check I had written to them over the years. My bank accounts, which had once been hemorrhaging funds to support their endless requests, were suddenly under my command again. The sense of power, however small, was a victory I hadn't tasted in years. I felt the weight lift off my shoulders, the tight grip of exploitation loosening as I closed those financial doors. But I didn't stop there. I had assets, things that I had worked for my entire life. A small house, a few possessions that had once been precious to me. All of them held memories of a life that had been lived with purpose and sacrifice. It was painful, but I knew I couldn't leave anything for them to take. So I sold what I could. My jewelry, my car, a couple of valuable antiques that had been handed down through generations. It was a hard decision, one that came with a heavy heart, but the liberation that followed was worth every pang of guilt. The moment the checks stopped coming, I knew the storm was about to hit. It didn't take long. The phone calls started, first from Robert. He was furious. "Mom, what's going on? Why are you doing this?" His voice cracked with confusion and anger. "You can't just stop helping us. We're struggling. Do you know how hard it is to make ends meet? You've been a lifeline for us." I stayed calm, my voice steady. "You didn't hesitate to take my money when you needed it, Robert. But now, when I need something,
This is an emotionally charged, deeply personal story of an elderly woman's betrayal by her family. The voiceover should guide the listener through her vulnerability, anger, and eventual empowerment. The tone must evolve alongside the emotional shifts in the character's journey. The worst part was the silence.
The way people stopped greeting me in the hallway, the way they stopped inviting me to community events. I had lived in this town for decades, built relationships, contributed to charity, and yet now no one would even look me in the eye. I felt like an outcast in the very community I had helped build. And still, Sarah's campaign continued. The gossip spread like wildfire. I began hearing rumors about how I was ungrateful and selfish. It seemed to be everywhere, at church, the grocery store, even among my old friends. One afternoon, I overheard a group of women gossiping about me while I stood near the bread aisle. "She's really gone off the deep end, hasn't she? Cutting off her own children like that?" one of them whispered, unaware I was standing just a few feet away. I felt the shame rising in my chest. For the first time in my life, I was being judged not by my actions, but by the version of me that Sarah had crafted. This was exactly what they wanted, to isolate me, to tear me apart publicly, to make me feel as if I had nowhere to turn. They knew I didn't have many friends left, not after years of sacrificing everything for them. They knew that if they could control the narrative, they could make me into the villain in everyone's eyes. But despite all of this, I refused to give in. I wasn't going to let them win. They thought they could use my love against me, manipulate my emotions, and turn me into someone I wasn't. But I wasn't the same person I had been before. I was stronger now, more determined. They had tried to break me down, to make me feel ashamed, but all it did was fuel the fire inside me. I spent hours in my room reflecting on the injustice of it all, the betrayal, the public shaming, the way my family had turned their backs on me, all in the name of self-preservation. But I was done being passive. I was done being the victim. I was going to make them see the truth. And the truth wasn't about me abandoning them. It was about them abandoning me first, for money, for selfishness, for greed. It wasn't just my family's betrayal that was breaking me. It was the isolation, the alienation from the people I had spent my life caring for. But as painful as it was, it also made me more resolute. They thought they could break me by using social pressure and gossip, but all it did was reinforce my decision to fight back. They had manipulated everyone they could, but they couldn't control me anymore. My resolve strengthened with each passing day. The battle had only just begun. The days that followed the courtroom battle were filled with a strange mix of vindication and disbelief. As the dust settled, the repercussions for my children were swift and devastating. The truth had finally come to light, and they could no longer hide behind their lies. Sarah and Robert, once revered in the community as hardworking individuals, were now being shunned, their reputations tarnished beyond repair. Social media posts began to surface, people speaking out about their deceitful behaviors, recounting the times they had been lied to or taken advantage of. Their social circles began to shrink as more and more people distanced themselves from the pair. Friends they had once counted on to stand by them suddenly turned their backs, and their business contacts dropped them like a hot stone. It was as if the very foundation of their lives had crumbled beneath them. I could hear it in the whispers as I walked through town. "Did you hear about Sarah and Robert? How could they do that to their own mother?" Their shame was no longer confined to our family. It had become public knowledge, and it spread through the community like wildfire. The financial consequences hit just as hard. Robert had lost his business deals, contracts that were once guaranteed, now hanging by a thread. The bank came after the loans I had co-signed for him, and creditors began to call, demanding payment. The once comfortable lifestyle they had enjoyed was slipping away, and I couldn't help but feel a certain sense of justice in watching it all unfold. They had gambled away my trust, my money, and my love, and now it was time for them to face the consequences of their actions.
Sarah, too, felt the sting of her actions. She had drained my savings under the guise of a family emergency, but those emergency funds had been spent on extravagant vacations and luxury items. Now, those creditors she had ignored came knocking, and she found herself unable to pay off her mounting debts. The trust fund I had set up for my grandchildren was empty, and she had no means to repay the money that was rightfully theirs. The reality of the situation was sinking in. Her lavish lifestyle had come to an end. And then there was me, the woman who had spent decades sacrificing for them, the woman who had given everything only to be betrayed in the end. The community's support began to shift. Where once I had been a quiet, passive figure, now I was seen as a symbol of strength, of resilience. People who had once whispered behind my back now approached me with respect, offering their condolences for what I had gone through and applauding my courage in standing up for myself. Neighbors who had once sided with my children now came forward to share their own stories of betrayal, of manipulation, of how they had been treated poorly by Sarah and Robert. I had not just gained sympathy, I had gained allies. I had become a source of inspiration for those who had long felt oppressed by their own families or taken advantage of by others. It was an odd feeling, one that was both empowering and bittersweet. I spent a lot of time alone in the days following the confrontation, reflecting on what had happened and what it meant for me. The emotional toll of the battle had been heavy. I had spent so many years hoping for a better relationship, wanting to believe that my children would eventually see the love I had given them and reciprocate it. But all those years of sacrifice and love had only left me vulnerable, manipulated, and discarded. As I sat quietly in my home, I allowed myself the space to grieve for the relationship I had lost. I cried for the woman I had been before, the hopeful, trusting mother who had only wanted the best for her children. It was a painful acknowledgement that I would never be able to go back to that version of myself, that the dream of a happy, united family had been shattered beyond repair. But I also allowed myself to feel a sense of relief, a sense of peace in knowing that I had finally done what needed to be done. The first attempts at reconciliation came almost immediately. Robert reached out to me in the days after the trial, his voice filled with feigned remorse. "Mom, I've made mistakes. I know I've hurt you, but I'm sorry. I've learned my lesson. Can we start over?" I could hear the desperation in his tone, the man who once seemed so proud and invincible, now crumbling under the weight of his own mistakes. And then there was Sarah, calling me in the middle of the night, her voice trembling with what I could only assume was genuine regret. "Mom, I was wrong. I know that now. I lost everything, and I have no one to blame but myself. Can you forgive me? Please, I need you." But as I listened to their pleas, something inside me held me back. I'd heard these words before, empty apologies masked as desperation. I had been manipulated for so long that now I couldn't trust their words. I knew that the guilt and shame they felt were genuine, but I also knew that these feelings would not last. Their pattern of behavior has shown me that they only wanted forgiveness when it served their interests. They had never truly understood the pain they had caused me. It was time to set the terms, to ensure that this time I wouldn't be exploited again. "I'm willing to forgive you," I told them, my voice steady but firm. "But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. You've broken my trust, and that's something that cannot be easily repaired. If you truly want to rebuild a relationship with me, it will be on my terms." I paused, making sure they understood the gravity of what I was saying. "I won't be there to bail you out again. You need to rebuild your lives on your own. I won't be your safety net anymore. If you want a relationship with me, it will be based on respect, accountability, and honesty. No more lies, no more manipulation. If you can prove to me that you can live with integrity, then maybe we can start over. But don't think for a second that I'll
ever allow myself to be used again. They were quiet for a moment, the weight of my words sinking in. I could hear the hesitation in their responses, the uncertainty of whether they could meet the standards I had set. But I didn't feel guilty. I had given them more than enough chances, and now it was time to put my foot down. They needed to prove themselves, not just to me, but to themselves. "Mom, we're sorry," Robert said, his voice softer now.